According to the Orthodox calendar, in September of 2024, we will be embarking on the 7,533rd year since the creation of the world. The Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire itself used this reckoning of the year for the majority of their history. In the Greek-speaking Christian world, from the 7th century until the 18th century, this was the universally accepted count of the years. Not all who endeavor to calculate the beginning of the world arrive at the same number, however. Various sects of Protestantism have also attempted to manually calculate the date of creation in an effort to determine the true current year, coming to entirely different conclusions, usually around 6,000 years more or less. The Jewish calendar itself still counts from the creation, claiming that the coming year is 5,785. But if the calendar which brings us to the year 7,533 is so well accepted by the bulk of Orthodox Christian tradition, then why bother reinventing the wheel? The first reason is because many Orthodox scholars themselves are questioning the legitimacy of this number. I have personally brought up this issue to Father Stephen DeYoung in a private conversation, and he claims that much of the basis for the count of the year is based on errors and misreadings of the Greek Old Testament. A popular example in the public eye is Seraphim Hamilton's Revised History series. He works with guest Kenneth Griffith, who is an academic, challenging the notion of a history that appears to be roughly 1,500 years younger than previously thought. If you'd like more information on that, I recommend The Bible and History: Rethinking the Ancient World on Seraphim Hamilton's YouTube channel. In addition to the realization among many Orthodox of the problems with the old calendar's reckoning of the year since creation, I've found a great deal of joy from investigating this subject myself and trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Here I'd like to throw my hat into the ring and propose that I have found the true year, and that I can prove it beyond all doubt. If you just want the number without the explanation, here it is. The year 5,954 since the creation of the world as of September 2024. Let's begin. First, let's explore the reasons why people are able to come up with different numbers for the date of creation. It should be simple addition, right? What's so complicated about that? There are three main variables that make dating the creation difficult. The first is Genesis. In Genesis, we are given a list of lifespans of the patriarchs from Adam until Noah in chapter 5, and from Noah, or really Shem, until Abraham in chapter 11. And the issue is that there are wildly different numbers given for these lifespans in the Greek Old Testament than in any of the other versions. The Greek tradition has gone with these older lifespans and thus come to numbers that are around 1,500 years more than the calculations performed by Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish scholars. The second main problem is how to calculate the time between Joseph's slavery in Egypt and the exodus of all Israel some generations later. This is a critical piece that we aren't given explicit dates for, and the only clue is the verse in Exodus 12, which states, "Now the length of time that the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. This is problematic because it leaves open to interpretation the starting period for this count. If this weren't bad enough, the manuscripts even differ on the wording of this verse and open the possibility of seemingly endless options for a conceptual framework of the 430-year time period. The third problem is where to establish an anchor point to recorded history. In order to find out how many years have passed since creation, there has to be a reliable event that can be counted to via the Bible and tradition and counted from via historical records. The obvious anchor point for counting would be the birth of Christ, but we are incentivized to find an earlier one since the Bible has very little to say about the years approaching and within the Second Temple period. After solving these three issues, Genesis genealogies, Exodus 12, and the anchor point to recorded history, the rest can be solved with simple addition. The majority of the essay is going to be about defending my position on these three controversial points, and then I'll conclude with a demonstration of my calculation. The Orthodox world has traditionally used the Greek Septuagint for reckoning the years since creation, and that would place us at the eve of 7,533. However, this is in stark disagreement to every other manuscript of the Old Testament. Most English Bible translations are based on the Hebrew scribal tradition preserved within Judaism, called the Masoretic text. To demonstrate how much longer recorded lifespans can be when comparing the Greek and the Hebrew, let's look at Genesis 5, verse 6. Now Seth lived 205 years and begot Enosh. That's the Greek version. However, in the Hebrew version, it says that Seth begot Enosh after 105 years. There are many such cases as this, which add up to a massive discrepancy between the Greek and the Hebrew. But why do we have different versions of the Old Testament at all? The Pentateuch, being the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was originally written in Hebrew by Moses and entrusted to the Jewish people by the Holy Spirit for safekeeping. In the 3rd century BC, a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt wanted the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, and this was done by 70 elders, hence the name Septuagint. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire primarily by the Greek language, this version of the Old Testament was preferred for the vast majority of Christian communities, especially those in Egypt and Asia Minor. Where this gets interesting is when other manuscripts are thrown into the mix and given their due attention. Many Orthodox who consider this question believe that the discussion on which manuscript to use is limited only to the testimony of the Greek Septuagint and the Jewish Masoretic text. However, there is more to the story. We also have copies of the Old Testament from various time periods in a variety of other languages. We have the Onkelos Aramaic Targums from the 1st century AD, kept within the Jewish tradition, the Syriac Peshitta from the 2nd century AD, belonging to the original Antiochian Christians, the Latin Vulgate from the 4th century, translated by St. Jerome for the Western Church, and, best of all, the Dead Sea Scrolls, also in Hebrew, from possibly as early as the 3rd century BC and as late as the 1st century AD, certainly from a Jewish group at a time prior to the ministry of Christ. When we compare all of these additional witnesses, we discover something shocking. All of them agree on Genesis 5's numbers except for the Greek. The Greek is the only version that contradicts both versions of the Hebrew, the Aramaic, Syriac, and Latin accounts of Genesis 5. Let's use Genesis 5:13 as an example across all of these texts. The Greek says, and Canaan lived after his begetting Mahalalel 740 years, and he begot sons and daughters. In the Masoretic, Aramaic, Syriac, Latin, and Dead Sea Scrolls, Canaan lives after begetting Mahalalel not 740 years, but 840 years. Every other language was able to come to agreement on the numbers in Genesis 5, so how did the Greek make such an obvious and embarrassing error? This remains uncertain, but we can be sure that the majority here are correct. Many times, the narrative for why the Greek differs from the Hebrew from a Greek perspective is that allegedly the Jews who rejected Christ later changed the numbers to obfuscate his legitimacy. But this cannot be true, since the Syriac and Latin Christians got the same numbers as the Jews, and the Dead Sea Scrolls date from a time before Christ at all. Without motive, the only explanation remaining is that it's just far more likely that the Greek is wrong than for the others to all be wrong in the exact same way across different time periods and languages. So for this reason, in calculating the date from the beginning of the world, we must use the group of versions that all agree with the Hebrew. Moving on, we have our second major problem to deal with. What do we make of the 430 years of slavery? We have a lot of variables going on here, so to get to the bottom of it, we're going to fan out the array of our options and chisel away at them by elimination until we arrive at a much smaller set. From there, we'll bring in an extra source and rely on the methods used by tradition in order to check our own fallible understanding, especially since, in this case, we would otherwise be reduced to our own guesswork. Here we go. So what do we know for sure? Well, Exodus 12:40 tells us that after 430 years to the day of dwelling in Egypt, the Israelites left. This means that we're going to be guessing when this started, since we know when it ended. What are our options for Israel entering Egypt? It could be when Abraham sojourned in Egypt during the famine, he being the symbolic beginning of Israel's story. It could be when Joseph entered Egypt, since his time in slavery was the microcosmic beginning of the larger process of what would unfold on the nation as a whole. It could also be when Jacob and his sons came to Joseph and were allotted their portions in Goshen, Jacob's name being Israel at that point. Or it could be at a time when the slavery itself begins, at some indeterminate time after Joseph's passing. If that array of options weren't enough, it gets bigger. This version from the Masoretic text isn't even the only version of the verse. The Greek version says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel when they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. I know I gave the Greek a hard time earlier, and this is one that the other four versions also appear to disagree with. However, it is possible to read these two versions of the text without necessitating mutual exclusion. That is, it's realistically possible to say that the texts which say Egypt don't have to be read as excluding Canaan from being implied. There is room for a harmonization of these texts, one being the shorthand and the other being explicit facts. You may not initially think this is probable, even if technically possible. What makes it probable is the fact that the Greek version actually corroborates something very unexpected: the Jewish oral tradition. Why is this significant? Because 3 of our 5 other apparently disagreeing manuscripts belong to what the Jewish oral tradition claims to be interpreting: the Masoretic, the Aramaic, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Jewish tradition of calculating the year since creation, they outline their interpretation of Exodus 12:40 in Seder Olam Rabbah. The rabbis claim that the traditional understanding of this 430-year period is that it began as soon as Abraham entered the land of Canaan for the first time from Ur Chaldea. Not only is this the traditional Jewish understanding, but the Christian tradition supports this understanding of the Exodus 12 prophecy as well. The Byzantine historian Ducas writes in 1460, explaining the calculations behind the imperial calendar. In this series of calculations, he explains that the period between Abraham's sojourning and the exodus from Egypt is 430 years. This pattern is generally followed with little exception by the first millennium Christian writers attempting to establish the date of creation. Here, we get to allow all versions to agree with one another and rely on an ancient interpretive tradition. The Greek is making explicit what is implicit in the Hebrew version, from which the other versions came at various time periods. The masters of the Hebrew oral tradition agree with the Greek, allowing the official Christian and Jewish positions to be in harmony about this question. Now, with the concept established, it seems that we are looking to begin this date at the time that Abraham entered Canaan. The book of Genesis says that he entered the land of Canaan at age 75, leaving his family in Haran. However, there is a strong tradition that says Abraham's entrance into the land at age 75 was actually his second journey to Canaan. According to this tradition, he left Ur Chaldea and arrived in Canaan for the first time at age 55. After some years, he then temporarily backtracked to join his family in Haran. While there, God called him to permanently settle in the land at age 75, which we find recorded in Genesis. We'll come back to this later, but for now, we're close enough to our solution on this issue. Finally, we come to the great bridge between the prophets and the academy, the anchor point. In order to find the perfect connection, we're going to need a historical event that occurs in the Bible and also in recorded history. Reliability is our most important priority here, so we should avoid using events with disputed dates unless we absolutely have to. Two common options chosen are the birth of Christ and the Babylonian exile. The one with Christ's birth is difficult since it involves a certain interpretation of Daniel 9's prophecy. I'm not saying that I disagree. I do believe it's about the first advent, but it's still shaky at best when it comes to generating precise figures. The second option isn't ideal either, since the exile of Babylon is disputed by historians in the exact date, and linking the historical claims to a biblical king's reign or deposition is difficult because there were several stages of destruction and captivity that occurred over the course of several years. Lucky enough for us, we have one that is both earlier and more reliable: the exile of the northern kingdom. When the northern kingdom of Israel was attacked by the Assyrian Empire, the city of Samaria was destroyed in an event recorded to the precise year by both the Bible and the Assyrian royal annals. The undisputed year for this event was 722 BC, biblically in the 6th year of the reign of King Hezekiah. This is by far the most reliable and easiest event to use. Now that we have our 3 major problems solved, we have one last variable to introduce before running the numbers. Let's go back to the age at which Abraham first entered the land. There is a credible source of Jewish oral tradition that specifies the age at which Abraham first entered the land, the Book of Jasher. This isn't the one referenced in the Bible, but it is the reflection of ancient oral traditions about the events of Genesis in greater detail committed to writing. Personally, I trust it for the most part, and it might as well give us a potential option to work with, so that we aren't forced to use Abraham's second entrance to Canaan if we don't want to. It just gives another option if other factors suggest it could make sense. In this midrash, it says that Abraham was 55 when he left Ur Chaldea to sojourn in Canaan for the first time, leaving his family behind in Haran. He stayed for a short while and went back to Haran with his family since he wasn't quite ready to make the full commitment. Then, as Genesis also says, at 75, he entered the land permanently. So that's our additional info. If for other reasons, when we run the numbers, it could make more sense to use 55 instead of 75, we have that in our back pocket. Here's the moment of truth. Let's add them up. In Genesis 5, we get the ages of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah. So let's take the numbers from the verses that tell us how old each were at the time of having their sons. That gives us 130 years for Adam, 105 years for Seth, 90 years for Enosh, 70 years for Canaan, 65 years for Mahalalel, 162 years for Jared, 65 years for Enoch, 187 years for Methuselah, and 182 years for Lamech when he begot Noah. So, to recap, from the creation of Adam until the birth of Noah is a total of 1,056 years. The next block we're going to calculate is the time from the birth of Noah until the sojourning of Abraham in Canaan. For right now, let's use the second entrance to Canaan at age 75 to see what we get. In Genesis 7, it says that Noah was 500 years old when he begot Shem. In Genesis 11, it says that Shem was 100 years old when his son was born. 35 for Arpachshad, 30 for Shelah, 34 for Eber, 30 for Peleg, 32 for Reu, 30 for Serug, 29 for Nahor, and 70 for Terah, when he begot Abram. Adding these up, and adding Abram's 75 years prior to sojourning, we come to 965 years between the birth of Noah and the sojourning of Abram. Alternatively, 945 if we want to use the number given in Jasher for Abram's first entrance to the land. From here, we add on the 430 years from the Exodus passage to take us to the point of departure from Egypt. After that, we have a verse in 1 Kings chapter 6 that tells us there were either 480 years or 440 years between the Exodus and the building of the first temple in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Again, this presents a similar dilemma between versions as Genesis 5. The Greek incorrectly says 440 years, while the Masoretic Aramaic, Syriac, Latin, and there's no Dead Sea Scrolls for this one, all disagree and say 480 years. So, we add 480 years to our running tally and resume in the 4th year of King Solomon. Solomon reigned for 40 years total, giving us 36 that aren't already accounted for. Going by the kings of Judah until the 6th year of Hezekiah, we have 17 for Rehoboam, 3 for Abijah, 41 for Asa, 25 for Jehoshaphat, 8 for Jehoram, 1 for Ahaziah, 6 for Queen Athaliah, 40 for Joash, 29 for Amaziah, 52 for Uzziah, 16 for Jotham, 16 for Ahaz, and only 6 of Hezekiah's 29 total years. 2 Kings 18:10 says, "And Shalmaneser captured it at the end of 3 years. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of King Hosea of Israel, Samaria was captured." For choosing between Kings versus Chronicles, as far as I'm aware, all scribal errors resulting in apparent contradictions occur in numbers irrelevant to our log of the durations of kingship. Now, as far as manuscript differences go, we are blessed to find 0 differences in any of the mentioned kings between the Greek, Masoretic, Aramaic, Syriac, Latin, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, weren't available. From Rehoboam to Hezekiah, all manuscripts have the exact same numbers, giving us a total of 296 years between the 4th year of King Solomon and the 6th year of King Hezekiah. Going from 722 BC to 2025 AD, since the new year will be starting in September, gives us 2,747 years of recorded history from our anchor point in biblical chronology. Adding up all of these numbers gives us a grand total of 5,974 years since the creation of the world. Now, you may ask yourself, if we're using the Hebrew version of the 2 main points of contention within our calculation, how come we didn't arrive at their supposed year of 5,785? The reason is a mystery, although I have my suspicions on motive. I will console you with the simple fact that this problem is popular and well known as the missing years problem with the Jewish calendar. According to their calendar, the Babylonian exile would have happened supposedly in 422 BC, and the Persian rule of Judea would have been less than a fifth of the historical account. And there are many problems that all distort the record of time, specifically in the Second Temple era. None of this has to do with the assumptions about the period of Egyptian slavery or Genesis 5's numbers, since those are supported by Christian traditions as well. Now, I'd like to finally suggest that the most sensible thing to do is to subtract those additional 20 years from the possibility of beginning with Abram's sojourning. Here's why. In Genesis 15, we have a prophecy given to Abram just before he begets Ishmael. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there." We know that when Abraham had Isaac, that Ishmael was 13, with 2 additional years for the decision to take Hagar and her pregnancy. This leaves us with the vision likely happening 15 years prior to the birth of Isaac when Abraham was 100. Meaning that if Abraham was 85 when he had the vision which predicted the Exodus to occur in 400 years' time, then it must have been 30 years prior that the Exodus 12 prophecy began to count, at age 55 in the life of Abram. This supports the book of Jasher's testimony that at the age of 55, Abram first entered the land of Canaan before taking a temporary trip back to his family in Haran. If we then take 20 years off of our calculation, we arrive at the true age of the world, going on 5,954 years this September. This places the beginning of the world at 3,929 BC and is remarkably close to the calculation of 8th century English Benedictine monk Saint Bede the Venerable, whose chronology places the beginning of the world at 3,952 BC, a mere 23 years earlier than my calculation. Saint Bede is responsible for writing the ecclesiastical history of the English people and is one of the greatest lights to ever come from the British Isles. Now, why is it significant that we are going into the year 5,954, more or less, as opposed to 7,533? That is the question that I'll be exploring next time.